Welcome to our first iteration of the Brownfield webinar series. Thank you for joining us. We created this series to provide information and resources about brownfields, remediation, and redevelopment. Today, we will be breaking down the basics of brownfields, what they are, how they form, and how we can move towards health-centered soil restoration. And so I would like to let everyone know that there is interpretation available for those who would prefer to receive the presentation in Spanish. Please make sure to follow the steps listed here. Click on the language interpretation button, followed by selecting your preferred language. And if you're choosing Spanish, make sure you mute the original audio to ensure you will only listen to the Spanish audio.
Sheena, I'll just say it in Spanish real quick. Hola a todos, ¿cómo están? Buenos días, muchas gracias por acompañarnos hoy en nuestro seminario de los terrenos baldíos. Bienvenidos. Si necesitan interpretación del lenguaje, por favor hagan clic en el botón para interpretación del lenguaje, que es un mundo, y ahorita lo vamos a aprender. Y seleccionen su lenguaje preferido, ya sea en inglés o en español, y asegúrense de que le den clic en el botón silenciar audio original, para que puedan escuchar el audio únicamente en español. Así que ahora en este momento vamos a aprender la interpretación y puede hacer su elección de su lenguaje preferido. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Paula. And also we would like to highlight some community norms to ensure language justice throughout the presentation. If you find yourself unmuting for the Q&A at the end, please keep these aspects in mind. Slow down so the interpreter has ample time to interpret. Speak up so the interpreter can clearly hear you. State your name when you speak, and please respect the idea of one mic and one person speaks at a time. And some general housekeeping for this webinar. Please type in the chat for a Q&A for any comments or questions. And there will be a Q&A at the end, which will allow you to raise your hand and unmute yourself. And please keep in mind to choose your language preference for appropriate interpretation. This Brownfield webinar series is born out of the TIERRA project led by the Land Use and Health team at PSR-LA. TIERRA is PSR-LA's tool for integrative, equitable, restorative, remedial, and advanced solutions for health future generations project. It addresses legacy soil contamination and the dearth of safe, healthy, and accessible parks and green space in South Central. It also identifies best practices within the toolkit to ensure that park and open space projects on contaminated soil are comprehensively developed through an efficient and robust community-led planning process. We've also built a policy agenda as a list of demands and priorities that we would like decision makers to consider regarding brownfield remediation and redevelopment. So some key questions we'll be exploring today are: what is a brownfield? What sort of uses create brownfields? What types of chemicals are found in brownfields? What are the health risks of living on or near brownfields? What's the history behind the placement of brownfields in Los Angeles? What are some examples of brownfields in Los Angeles? And what are some ways brownfields are remediated? And to help us learn further about this, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. We have Dr. Ann Blake and Ilse Mispequero. Dr. Ann Blake is an independent consultant with nearly 30 years of experience finding safer alternatives to industrial chemicals and materials in global manufacturing. Her work has included creating criteria for environmentally preferable purchasing, eco-labels, and product rating systems, as well as local, national, and international chemicals policy reform. She is a co-author of the BizNGO 2014 Plastic Scorecard and of Perennial Industrial Crops, Green Chemistry, and Carbon Sequestration in the 2019 Springer Handbook of Ecomaterials. Prior to consulting, Dr. Blake worked for the California Environmental Protection Agency's Department of Toxic Substances Control as a hazardous waste inspector and pollution prevention coordinator. Dr. Blake has a BA from Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts and a PhD in molecular genetics and neural development from the University of Oregon. Dr. Blake's current work focuses on the intersection between climate adaptation, safer materials, and economic equity. She currently serves as the executive director of the Jennifer Altman Foundation in Bolinas, California, funding environmental health and justice efforts globally. Idelmis Vaquero is an Equal Justice Works Fellow based in Huntington Park. The Equal Justice Works Fellowship Project is focused on advocating for the cleanup of the Exide facility and communities affected, including her hometown of Boyle Heights. Idelmis started her journey with Communities for a Better Environment as an organizing intern back in 2014. Idelmis is a graduate of UCLA School of Law and received her BA from Wellesley College. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Blake and Idelmis.
Thank you, Sheena. Thank you all. Good morning, and thank you for being here today. We really appreciate PSR-LA's organization of this webinar and also inviting us to speak. Idelmis and I will be tag teaming on the first few slides, and then we'll each do a separate and related presentation on different aspects of brownfields and what they are. So we're going to start with the definition. The Brownfields program was started by US EPA in 1995 and expanded in 2002, and it is driven by this definition of a brownfield. So as you can see on the slide, a brownfield is a property, the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. The regulatory interpretation of this emphasizes the reuse piece, that a brownfield is something, a piece of land that someone wants to reuse. Idelmis?
Yeah, I wanted to highlight something interesting because as you were mentioning the reuse aspect, what stood out to me is the potential presence term. And I think this means potential contamination is perceived, but sometimes in brownfields it's not always yet confirmed. In California alone, there are 90,000 brownfields from the last estimate, and there's a huge backlog of brownfield sites that need to be tested still. So even if it's a known, it's still considered a brownfield. And this uncertainty is often complicated by the fear that a new owner, or which oftentimes isn't the polluter, it could face liability under federal laws like RCRA and CERCLA. And so that's a big part of the way brownfields stay as is for so long.
And we forgot to launch our poll before we did this definition, so this next question should be relatively easy for you to answer. The first question in this poll that we're going to launch is, do you know what a brownfield is? And maybe you can answer it as, did you know before we gave you the definition? So that should be up right now, so we'll take a second to have you do that. And then Sheena, will you get the results of the poll? Great. All right, how are we doing on that? Oh, there we go. I guess we did a good job, Idelmis, on our very first slide, because 64% of you now know what a brownfield is. So thank you. Hopefully you'll have a little more sense of what a brownfield is by the end of our presentation. Jasmine, the next slide, please. So now you've seen the regulatory definition that US EPA uses. What we're going to do next is talk about what uses can create brownfields. The most common ones are what are referred to as light industry, so dry cleaning, metal plating, gas stations, and I will go into a few of those in a little more detail in my upcoming slides. Idelmis talked about the 90,000 brownfields in California. There are approximately, or estimated, 450,000 across the US. And as I mentioned, the Brownfields program was created in 1995. And as of January 2023, per the US EPA website, approximately 36,000 of those estimated sites have been assessed, and just under 2,500 have been cleaned up. So I was going to say for those of you counting at home, but I decided to put it on the slide, that's less than 10%, or rather 8% of the estimated number of brownfields extant and less than half of 1% that have been cleaned up. Now, so it's not just industrial uses that can create brownfields. There are sort of broader factors in play, and Idalis is going to be talking about that. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so I wanted to offer some social context behind why I think brownfields exist. So one, as a manufacturing and industrial base declines and moves overseas or to other states with less stringent environmental regulations, that leaves a lot of brownfields in California. And unless a site is permitted by RCRA or a limited number of other federal statutes, and unless there happens to be some type of enforcement action on that site that would require the owner to conduct cleanup, there's a high chance that an owner can abandon or leave the contaminated site as is without further any cleanup. The second reason I think it's abandoned or idle property. So for example, as some folks may know, the county and city of LA, for example, are phasing out oil drilling. And so there's going to be an ongoing effort to properly remediate and guide the redevelopment of these former oil sites. And that's just an example of how abandoned and idle properties become brownfields. And third, by definition, environmental racism creates the conditions that led to the overconcentration of industry close to low-income communities of color and continued disinvestment in EJ communities. And lastly, I would say redlining, which is also at play here, and I will be happy to talk more about this later in the presentation. Back to you.
Great, thank you. So next slide. So what we're going to go now is to talk a little bit about the chemical end of this, the technical end. What are you likely to find in a brownfield? So what chemicals and toxics are likely to be found in a brownfield? Again, the top 3 likely uses that create a brownfield: dry cleaners, metal platers, and gas stations. So dry cleaners, the most likely contaminant is the cleaning solvent itself, and the one that has been most commonly used for the last few decades, since approximately the 1950s, is perchloroethylene, which you may also have been heard as referred to as PERC. There has been a long effort to try and find safer substitutes for this, which I'll go into in a minute. Metal platers, so I will also talk a little bit later about what metal plating is, but just briefly, it's a way of getting a layer of metal onto a surface, like a chrome or cadmium or lead or zinc in some cases, so not a heavy metal, to provide a more durable surface. It involves baths of acid and baths that have dissolved metal in them. And all of those, once they have been heavily used, generate a sludge, and they get to a point where they can no longer be used and become waste. And that is the most likely contamination, either those solvents or heavy metals from metal plating. Gas stations, as you might imagine, are primarily contaminated with the things that come out, that we put into and come out of cars. So oil for the engines and fuel for the engines. And that is primarily volatile organics, volatile meaning that they evaporate easily, which unfortunately also means that there's an increased likelihood of exposure and contribution to air pollution. One of the most common is benzene, which is a known contaminant that comes, and basically is a contaminant of anything that comes from the refining of fossil fuel oil. Benzene is a known carcinogen, and it is actually regulated federally in gasoline to less than 2%, but there's a lot of gas at any given gas station from the process of delivering gas to cars, so benzene is a very common contaminant. Also PAHs, or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. I'll have that printed out or spelled out in a slide that's coming. These are the results of burning of any kind of fossil fuel. So again, volatile organics from fuel, benzene, and PAHs primarily come from gas stations, or the likely contamination found in gas stations. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there's been quite a bit of effort to get perchloroethylene out of dry cleaning, and it's been a long process. And clearly, this is not the most efficient way to get rid of a toxic chemical. And perchloroethylene is only the latest in a series of of some pretty nasty solvents that have been used. Believe it or not, the earliest solvent that was used for cleaning clothes in the early 20th century was gasoline. And those were usually put into industrial facilities that were outside urban areas. And they had a horrible habit of exploding because gasoline is extremely flammable. As more synthetic fabrics came in the 20s and 30s, different petroleum-based solvents were used for cleaning, including carbon tetrachloride for the chemists out there, and various other things. And finally, post-war, we got to perchloroethylene. In 1991, California's Air Resources Board identified perchloroethylene as a toxic air contaminant. It took another 10 years before, with the leadership of South Coast Air Quality Management District, and then the year later by CARB statewide, initiated through AB 998, a statewide phase out of perchloroethylene with financial incentives to switch from the expensive perc machines to the new machines. And I worked on this back in the mid 2000s, and in preparation for this presentation, looked to see where we were on perc machines. And I'm happy to report that as of January 1st of this year, perc machines are finally phased out across the state of California. Now, in the process of finding safer alternatives to perchloroethylene at dry cleaners, there have been other solvents that have been put forward as environmentally friendly, including one that you've probably seen at your neighborhood dry cleaner, namely green earth. Green earth is still a solvent. You need a solvent to clean dry cleanable clothes, but it has its own potential health hazards. It's a siloxane, and there are some potential health hazards there. So a lot of the work in LA and in San Francisco as well, but particularly LA has taken the lead on this. The Urban and Environmental Policy Institute at Occidental College has worked for a couple of decades now on finding safer alternatives to dry cleaning, and particularly wet cleaning, which is basically soap and water run by a computer, and trying to break the myth that clothes that need to be dry cleaned at all. So most apparel can be cleaned through wet cleaning. And another way of changing the system here is changing, removing the dry clean only label, which is something that is organized by the Federal Trade Commission. So there's been a long effort on here. But as you can see, it's been a couple of decades to try to get rid of PERC and move to safer solvents that protect both communities and the workers at dry cleaners themselves. So hopefully we can think of this as preventing future brownfields. So next slide, please. So again, I wanted to talk a little bit about metal plating. So the second most common, or a second among the common uses that create, industrial uses that create brownfields. I have to say, when I was looking for a photograph of this, when I was the hazmat inspector, I very rarely saw a plating shop as clean as the one that I see in this picture here, but I thought I'd put it up here as an aspirational goal. Ones like this in the manufacturing of printed circuit boards can be this clean. So again, metal plating is the process of putting a coating like a chrome or a cadmium or other, or in some cases zinc, onto metal surfaces to make them more durable. Zinc is among the cheaper plating. You'll see the pile of bolts, nuts and bolts here in the middle of this photograph. Those are zinc plated. To your left is a chrome hubcap. And then in the middle is an IKEA faucet, also chromed. So that's what chroming looks like. And as I mentioned before, those baths that you see in the photograph on the top right, those are the ones that will become spent at some point by dipping various pieces, dipping whatever it is you're putting in that you want to get plated on there, and sludge forms at the bottom. So the wastes come from that process. Next slide, please. So what are the health risks of living next to or on a brownfield? As you can see, we've talked about the different kinds of things different kinds of contamination that come from dry cleaning a gas station or metal plating. And those are organic solvents, usually very volatile, heavy metals, and PAHs, the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that come from the burning of any fossil fuel. Solvents generally have or can be carcinogenic, can cause reproductive hazards, in other words, make it difficult to bear a child, conceive or bear a child, and neurotoxicity or harm to the brain. Heavy metals can cause a variety of different effects, both acute, so short-term, and chronic, long-term. The initial exposures would probably show gastrointestinal and kidney. This is your body's normal attempt to try and eliminate hazards. And so you'll have the experience of diarrhea, nausea, abdominal pain as your body tries to get rid of a toxin. Nervous system disorders, the most likely is a feeling tingling in your hands and feet as your peripheral nervous system is impacted. Skin lesions, damage to the blood. Basically, these are systemic impacts of heavy metals. And as with PAHs, birth defects, and cancer. The picture on the right here, the little diagram is not, unfortunately, a happy honeybee hive. It's a polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon. I also wanted to offer a resource for health effects. That's the next slide. Thank you, Jasmine. A few years ago now, I worked with the Blue-Green Alliance, which is an alliance of the major manufacturing unions in the US and the Big Greens, and it was started by the United Steelworkers and the TIERRA Club, and then other manufacturing unions and other Big Greens have joined. And we worked with the Communication Workers of America. So this is a worker-designed website designed to summarize hazards of chemicals in the workplace. As you may know, OSHA requires that any exposure in a workplace, that workers in that workplace have access to information on it. So we designed this so that you could type that, assuming that workers would have access to the CAS number here, which you see, this is a little number that classifies and identifies any individual chemical or the standard chemical name. So we didn't build this for the general public, but this is one that you might find useful. It summarizes information from a whole series of resources, mostly by government or research institutions, and you can actually access those on this website as well. But if you type in, for example, benzene that I talked about earlier, what you'll get is what you see in this screenshot here, a summary of the short-term effects and the long-term effects. And if you scroll further down, how you're likely to get exposed to this particular chemical, in this case, through breathing or through your skin. So hopefully you'll find that resource useful. The next slide. So we've talked about what causes and creates brownfields, and now we'll do a quick summary of what the traditional approaches of cleaning up or remediating a brownfield. So the traditional approaches have been to leave, basically to leave the contamination in place or to dig and haul it. Both of these have disadvantages. Obviously, one is that the contamination is still there, or if you dig and haul it, it could potentially impact another neighborhood where you dump the contaminated soil. So traditional remediation includes caps and covers. These are just different levels of engineering of a covering of a contaminated site. One is just paving asphalt over the dirt, and asphalt itself, of course, has some exposure issues. And caps are slightly more engineered. So that is, you could do monitoring wells or monitoring of different aspects of the unremediated soil. Regulatory agencies, at least in California, have been shifting recently to greener technologies. So, for example, not digging and hauling, and using solar and biofuels where possible, and coordinating with agencies that regulate soil, air, and water. And one of the things we wanted to highlight is a very exciting emerging technology, which is bioremediation and plant remediation. So bioremediation can include everything from bacteria to plants and mushrooms. We have a diagram of that here. And as I understand it, this is going to be the topic of the next webinar in this series from PSR-LA. So we're just going to put a plug for that here. I will say that those of us that have been working in this field for a while are really excited about the possibility of mushrooms. Mushrooms have a remarkable ability to break down everything from heavy oil, from refining sites to PCBs and other man-made chemicals. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Idalmis. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Blake. Now I'm going to launch a poll, Sheena, with your help. So the next question is, do you know of any brownfields in your community? And whenever Sheena's ready, please release the result. Sheena, will you? Oh, thank you. Maybe, not sure. Yes. Okay, so 51% said yes, they know where brownfields are located in your community. That's good to know you're aware of some of the sites in your community. So I wanted to go back to what I mentioned a moment ago regarding redlining. That also plays a part in the placement of brownfields in EJ communities. The use of restrictive covenants was used to legalize the restriction and segregation of housing based on race. This is a 1939 map of Los Angeles by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. 4th grade D neighborhoods are coded in red. 3rd grade C areas are in yellow, followed by blue and green, and which are the most desirable neighborhoods. As you can see, the communities in Southeast LA and South LA were considered grade D and C, and this rating indicated that these neighborhoods were risky to issue mortgages. And these practices were also meant to preserve racial segregation, intergenerational poverty, and the continued wealth gap, which still exists today between white Americans and BIPOC communities. And this resulted in a systematic denial of economic investment in communities, governmental neglect, and the historic land uses and zoning practices, which created the placement of hazardous facilities in close vicinity to BIPOC communities that we see today. Next slide, please. So I wanted to compare the last slide with the map on this slide. This is a current map from DTSC's EnviroStore database, zoomed in on Los Angeles area. The dots are all inactive sites which either require further investigation, need action, or are no longer operating. The colors underneath represent CalEnviro's green in the score for each census tract. The red census tracts experience the highest pollution burden and have a high socioeconomic vulnerability when compared to other census tracts in the state, followed by orange, yellow, and green. As you can see, there's a strong correlation between the communities that would redline and those with brownfields today. In particular, I'd like to note the cluster of brownfields in the Alameda corridor, which lays between South LA and Southeast LA. I also wanted to note that this is the closest map that we can get to identifying brownfields in the state, or in LA for now, as this is zoomed in there. In fact, there isn't a specific layer for this database in this database for brownfields. So one has to look at the definitions of the terms for each of these layers that you see on the left side and decide whether it meets the definition of a brownfield. It's very tedious and complicated if you have to decide on your own, when in fact I think that better access to this information that is consistently updated is critical for communities to understand their exposure to brownfields and the environmental hazards they have. Next slide, please. And I wanted to go ahead and highlight an example of a brownfield, which is also one of CBE's campaigns in Southeast LA. This is the former Central Metal facility. CBE organized with community members for many years around the Central Metal site located in the Florence Firestone and Walnut Park communities. The Central Metal site was used to recycle industrial scrap metal and manufacturing metal tanks. Central Metal left piles of soil on the site, and one of these piles was tested and found to have hazardous levels of lead and arsenic. The facility was closed in 2016 after we were able to stop LA County Department of Regional Planning from issuing a conditional use permit for the facility. And most recently, we have been working with EPA, and in the coming months, EPA will release the soil results of residential yards near the site to see if lead and arsenic and other pollutants flew off-site. Although the owner is known, it is unclear if CMI is a financially viable owner, which is one of the requirements that makes cleanup necessary. But what ultimately makes it a brownfield is that there's no viable, financially viable owner that can pay for the cleanup. And so if the results show that the contamination is not enough to warrant putting it on the Superfund list, then it becomes could become eligible for cleanup under a federal state brownfields program. And ultimately here, community members are hopeful that the site actually does get on the Superfund list because that would allow EPA to do more work on the site. And it's been the one agency that we've had consistent communication with regarding this particular site. Next slide, please. I wanted to highlight some EJ principles in brownfield remediation and redevelopment. As Dr. Blake mentioned, the usual practice has been to either put a cap on a site or dig and haul the soil to a landfill, or that is either in state or most of the time out of state, which isn't always the cleanup method that local communities may want. A cap is not 100% effective, and in fact, there are studies showing that sea level rise could compromise caps located near the coast and re-expose communities. And the dig and haul method could also be problematic to communities who feel it is unfair to send their contaminated soil to other EJ communities. One of the things we have seen in this work is that there's often a conflict between the level of cleanup the agency authorizes and whether this is adequate for the end use. The cleanup levels for housing development, in our eyes, should be more protective, and so there's a need to change these regulations in the books. Second, I like to highlight the self-determination aspect of redevelopment, ensuring that the end use doesn't increase gentrification or displacement pressures in the community, and making sure that the public, there are public meetings as necessary to inform the communities of the plans on site. Oftentimes, brownfield redevelopment programs and state voluntary programs do not have the required detailed disclosure of or public input needed for the specifics of post-remediation use. So they, in general, just are general in nature, and the developer is only required to identify whether it is for an industrial, commercial, or residential. But the specifics of the proposed use are not very specific. So this may, and oftentimes it may not be known at the time the remediation plan is submitted for approval. But I think that this brings up the example, to bring up the example of Central Meadow. We recently heard that the site is was bought, and there are plans to use it to build a U-Haul rental store and 2 buildings for storage. And residents weren't consulted as part of this process, and no community meeting was held to let people know. So we had to inform the Department of Regional Planning about the fact that the site is being investigated by EPA, and that the digging and movement of soil could pose a threat to community health. We're hoping that this space would actually serve the community's needs as an area that is park poor and lacks access to fresh produce. So prioritizing the benefits of the community, to move on to the third point, prioritizing the benefits of the community, for example, we see as like the targeted hiring policy, local hiring, things that are actually beneficial to communities that improve the quality of life and services and amenities provided. And I think part of this is, to bring the Central Meadow example, we have been asking for the site to include a buffer zone between the areas where there will be a large amount of trucks and where they're close proximity to residential areas. We also have been requesting that if U-Haul ends up getting built, that they add design features and murals that support the aesthetic of the community and therefore make it a nicer place to look, and a nicer area to look at. Although, we would definitely just, going back to the second point, we would have liked to be consulted in the process, and that's oftentimes how we hear about these projects to begin with. At the end, once the facility or site has been, bought, and so it's not our decision to a certain extent. So I just offer those thoughts to highlight some of the principles that we share. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine and Dr. Blake, for such an insightful presentation. Now that you all have a bit more information on brownfields, we'd like to hear from you. If you could develop a brownfield in your community, what would you change it to? And I'll launch the poll right now. And I'll share the results. So it seems as though parks and green space definitely takes precedent, followed by affordable housing, community gardens, and community centers as the top votes for what you would like to see brownfields redeveloped in your community to be. We appreciate this input, and we definitely will consider that moving forward in our TIERRA project. Following that, as you can see, there is a lot to cover around brownfields, remediation, and redevelopment. And we're grateful for the opportunity as a webinar to educate around brownfields. Additionally, as part of the TIERRA project, we've created the TIERRA Toolkit, which is a guide to community-led, health-centered brownfield remediation. We're excited to preview the TIERRA Toolkit here, and we will be releasing it very soon, so please keep an eye out, as we would love to spread the toolkit widely. Following that, we'll go into Q&A now. So if you have any questions, please feel free to continue asking them in the Q&A function or in the chat. We do have a couple questions already asked by folks, so we'll head into those. During your presentation, Dr. Blake, some folks asked, are the gas station pollutants found on the surface or underground from leaks in tanks, or both?
My guess is both. There is an ongoing leaking underground storage tank program that is run both by US EPA and DTSC in California. So that both of those are sources of contamination. So surface, as you can imagine, from spills at a gas station, and then leaking underground storage tanks.
Sorry, I was not unmute. And someone also asked, is eco-friendly dry cleaning really eco-friendly?
So it depends on the specific solvent, but very often it can be better for the environment, but not necessarily better for workers. So in the example of D5, the green earth solvent, it probably is more eco-friendly, but there are still potential for health hazards.
Thank you for that. And an attendee also asked, I see that the chem hat is also translated into Vietnamese. Is there a reason for that? Are many of the workers who work with hazardous chemicals Vietnamese?
That I suspect we're working with nail salon workers. So that tends to be not an OSHA workplace, but the vast majority of nail salon workers, particularly in California, are Vietnamese, close to 75%. And so we wanted to add those resources and make those available.
Awesome, thank you. And for either Elaine or Dr. Blake, whoever feels most inclined to answer this question, we received a question on what can be done at the grassroots level to address brownfields?
Delmis, do you want to take this one?
I think I would. I would say get involved with organizations like CBE or other grassroots groups that are in your community. And yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done at the state level in California. I know that there's a hazardous waste management plan coming out with DTSC, the Department of Toxic Substances Control, that is addressing some of these ongoing issues with what we do with our contaminated soil. And so I would say those are important places to plug in.
Thank you, Idalmi. And someone also asked, what site did you get the red line map from? I missed the name when you said it.
I will send this. I will send it to PSR-LA, and then we can share that.
Awesome. Yes, we will be sharing the slides and the recording to all attendees after the presentation. And someone also asked, what are the requirements for ongoing monitoring post-remediation? Does it ensure the community can play a role, but doesn't solely fall on them?
Idalmis, I suspect you're more up to date on this as well than I.
I was looking for the typed out question. What are the requirements for ongoing monitoring post remediation? Not sure that I actually don't know what the. I think there's actually DTSC does have to do some sort of like every 5 years if there's some sort of cleanup, then DTSC or the consultant for that site will release a report of how the remediation methods are going. But I think it doesn't necessarily have a lot of community involvement, which I think is an important aspect of it in this situation. Like we think sometimes, you know, there's a crack in the cap, or there are other issues with the site that don't really get relayed to the community. And so I think there are places where we could require community involvement and informing the community.
And that sounds like an excellent question for DTSC's Brownfields coordinator and team. And I know they're eager to hear and have been working to get more input from community. And it looks like in the chat we've got where the red line map came from, or at least another place where it came from. Great, thank you for sharing that.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing resources, everyone. And some folks have also asked, are there different standards for remediation depending on what the post-remediation use of the land will be? Park versus building, residential versus industrial, for example.
Yeah, there's certainly different standards based on what the zoning is, and also what I think, which is also related to the end use portion. So I think it depends between whether it's industrial or a school or housing. And so yeah, there are different standards. I don't know. And for different chemicals as well. So often a complex system when work for community members to understand.
Right, and I believe there's also, one can put land use covenants on certain pieces of land and limit uses depending on what the contamination is and the level of cleanup.
Thank you. And this question is for you, Dr. Blake. Are the locations of the gas stations really dependent on each air district's rules?
I actually don't know the answer to that one, but I'm happy to research it. You're on mute, Sheena.
Thank you, sorry. Thank you, and we'd be happy to release a Q&A document after this presentation with further follow-ups from questions that were not completely answered. How about contamination from plating facilities? You mentioned inspecting some sites that didn't always look as clean. How were those sites reprimanded, or were they at all?
So keep in mind that I worked at DTSC from 1993 to 2002, so I'm a little outdated, but metal plating shops were common, and I was in the Northern California region. Several of them were closed down and have become cleanup sites. I'm sure they continue to operate in some cases, and they continue to be part of the surveillance and enforcement group facilities that are inspected by DTSC. So I can't answer the current question, but I'd be happy to refer to my colleagues who are still working at DTSC.
Thank you for that. And what type of efforts are being taken to responsibly dispose of the contaminated soils or plants where plants are used to clean up the brownfields? I think this question may also be answered by Jasmine if she's inclined.
Go for it, Jasmine.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I was doing logistical stuff back here.
It is, what type of efforts are being taken to responsibly dispose of the contaminated soil or plants where plants are used to clean up the brownfields in bioremediation methods?
Yeah, so we don't actually have an answer for that right now. That is something that we're still in the process of researching. That's a huge part of the TIERRA project, is actually to explore those different processes and methods. I think working, with, I think someone already mentioned the hazardous waste reduction plan that's in the process of being developed right now through DTSC, and sort of thinking about how do we get rid of waste responsibly. But through bioremediation, one of the benefits of it is reducing the amount of waste. So really being able to sort of condense or consolidate those toxins into a much sort of smaller mass, and then figuring out how to properly dispose of those toxics that are remaining. Because not all bioremediation methods actually create contaminated waste. Some plants are able to actually sort of break down the contaminant so that they're not harmful anymore. But there are some plants that sort of stabilize it, or excuse me, or sort of consolidate it. And so that's some of the research that's still ongoing. But that's a fantastic question.
That's a great question, and I would just thank you, Jasmine. I would echo all the things you've said, but also it's dependent on the contamination itself. Definitely the benefit of bioremediation is that you reduce the amount of, you take large quantities of soil and you concentrate down the contamination into a manageable amount, but it's still unfortunately a hazardous waste. So a heavy metal, for example, is always going to be a heavy metal. So that will be a hazardous waste that will need to be disposed of, but it'll be a much smaller volume. But as Jasmine said, there are some other things like PCBs, oils, and so forth that can be broken down by some plants and some fungi, so mushrooms. So I'm really looking forward to that. There is even some exciting research on PFAS, which many of you have heard of, the forever chemicals that are everywhere, from your waterproof jacket to your cooking pan to many other things. And those are very hard to break down, but there is some emerging evidence that fungi might even be able to do that. So that's a really exciting area of research. I'm so glad that PSR-LA and TIERRA are taking this on.
Yes, definitely. Microremediation is a very exciting technique that we're excited to explore further. And someone asked, what are the barriers or gaps to bioremediation being implemented as remediation options? I'm working on a myco and phytoremediation study on 3 brownfields in Los Angeles, and it was very difficult to gain access to implement a field study because of policy and other barriers.
I'm really thrilled to hear that you're working on that. I think the challenges are that it's still new and people aren't aren't used to the fact of doing it this way. So I'd love to talk to you more and engage with you to see if we can get past some of those policy barriers. And there's some other folks that I know that are working on micro remediation, particularly in post-fire landscapes. Some are based at UC Irvine that we could happily put you in touch with and see if we can come up with a field study, if that would be of interest.
Awesome. That was a fantastic question as well. Thank you all for your questions. We're running a bit short on time, so we'll answer a couple of questions, a couple more questions. And if we did not get to your question, we'll happily get to that through our Q&A document that will follow up this webinar. And one question that was posed is, how much does it cost to clean up a site? Are the private property owners responsible for remediation, or will the burden fall on the government and or community?
So I'm unfortunately going to give the classic scientist answer, which is it depends. Obviously, will depend on the size of the site, the level of contamination, how long it's been there. The US EPA Brownfields program does have a grants program. I believe Idames will probably know better if there's an equivalent. I assume there's an equivalent at state level in California. So it will, Idames, do you have there's going to be a range, obviously, but I think there's some information on the US EPA website about what the average cost is. And I will stop answering the question and let Idames take it on.
Yeah, I think by some definition, or I mean, a brownfield just remains as a brownfield because there isn't a lot of, there isn't an owner or someone, EPA or in the state level DTSC can go after. And so until DTSC or EPA has some sort of resources and time to look at the site, then they will finally remediate it. But it often, yeah, falls on the shoulders of community members and taxpayers to pay for that. Yeah.
We can definitely provide more links to grants programs and information on that front.
Thank you for that. And I also just want to give those who have their hand raised an opportunity to unmute themselves. So Jonathan Pruitt, if you would like to unmute yourself and ask a question, if that hand raise is still valid. Okay, I see that you lowered your hand, so we'll move on. And I'm going to go ahead and close the Q&A section. Thank you so much for your questions and your answers. I see Jesse Dela Cruz raised their hand, so I will allow them to speak.
Hello, PSR team. Thank you so much for this presentation and the incredible work that you're leading. I just wanted to make a comment that's, I guess, more specific to something we're experiencing at the moment in Lennox. You know, as you know, some of the work that's required to convert these vacant lots is go through certain, you know, municipality processes and in hopes to garner public and private funding to develop these spaces. Because, for instance, there was a vacant lot that was blighting the neighborhood for so long. We finally, you know, were able to develop it into a community garden. However, some of these leases can be tricky. So I was hoping if you can sort of provide any information as to what are some of the different services or areas you focus on as it pertains to leases, and you know, just as we're thinking about longevity in these projects. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jesse, for your question. We'll be sure to answer that in our Q&A doc. And so that concludes our presentation. Thank you all for joining us. We encourage you to fill out our post-webinar survey for some feedback and thoughts on the webinar and also some future topics. And on the next slide, we also have our contact information available. To folks who would like to reach out, if any questions come up after this webinar ends and you'd like to ask us those questions, we can definitely forward them to Edelmis and Dr. Blake. And thank you to Dr. Blake and Edelmis for such a wonderful presentation. We really appreciate all the information that you've gathered and shared around brownfields.